Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas, Collins, LLC.
I think this might just about constitute a quorum if we want to call the House to order. Thanks so much for coming today. And if you're not sure if you're in the right room, my name's Casey Cep, and I'm here to talk about my first book, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. So I'll give you a minute to decide it's not the right room or the right book for you. And in that minute, I'll just say, it's my first time in Baton Rouge, and indeed my first time in this chamber, and you might be a nerd to it, but it's an awfully beautiful place for the House to come to order and for the state legislature to gather. And I'm sure I'm not the only speaker today who's moved by these spaces and takes it as an opportunity to remind you of that sacred right to vote. We have such an important say in the men and women who come to occupy these chambers and the kinds of laws they occupy themselves with and the kinds of things they do with their time, that I hope being here reminds you that every year is an election year in most states, and whether you're electing the local, parish government or you're electing the president, every one of those elections is meaningful. And I think we're very lucky to live in a country, and you all, I'll tell you, are lucky to live in a state where the houses of democracy are so beautiful. And I hope you cherish them and protect them and, keep them from being laid siege by men and women who would use them for nefarious purposes. But that's the end of the evangelizing I'll do on behalf of democracy. But I'll tell you a little bit about an evangelist in my book. And probably most of y'all are here because of the last bit of my subtitle, Harper Lee. Obviously one of the most iconic authors in American history, but the truth is if you're picking up the book because you're only in it for Harper Lee, I feel obliged to warn you that she shows up on the first page and then she disappears as was her wont. So if you're in it for Harper Lee, you have to be patient because the first 2/3 of the book is actually preoccupied with a true crime story that caught her interest in 1977. And the first third of the book is about the alleged murderer in that crime story, and the second third is about his lawyer. And it's only the final third that's about Harper Lee's life and what made her a writer and what drew her attention to this case, and ultimately what was difficult for her about trying to turn this story into a book. So I like to conduct these things the way the book does, and so the first thing I'll read to you is from the first third of the book about this alleged murderer, Willie Maxwell. And I told you I was done evangelizing for democracy, but I was about to talk about someone who was an evangelical for something else, and Willie Maxwell was a Baptist preacher. And he'd been ordained in his local church after serving in the Army in World War II, and he came home and had a kind of itinerant ministry. He preached at various churches, and he preached revivals, and he took clergy work wherever he could find it because he was doing it around the edges of a lot of other jobs too. And the part of the Reverend section that I like to read is from 1972. And the thing to know about the Reverend Maxwell is by the time Harper Lee found out about his story, he was accused of killing 5 people. His first wife, his second wife, a brother, a nephew, and a stepdaughter. And in 1972, only that first wife had been found murdered, and the Reverend was the prime suspect, but the police, when they took that case to trial, they didn't get a conviction. And that surprised them because they had, an incredible witness, a neighbor of the Reverend's, who was supposed to testify that not only he had been out all night the night his wife was found murdered, but in fact, he'd called home and lured his wife to the very spot where her body was found. That witness, though, changed her testimony, and the police couldn't figure out why. She gave the Reverend an alibi, and it turned out a few months after that trial, she became the second Mrs. Maxwell. So that was why she changed her testimony, and that's where we'll pick up. Because people around this part of Alabama where all of these deaths were happening and all of these alleged murders were taking place came up with a theory about why the Reverend could get away with all this. And you can imagine, here was an African-American man in Alabama in the 1970s who was unlikely to get away with anything, but as far as his neighbors were concerned, he got away with everything. So this is from 1972. Whether or not the Reverend Willie Maxwell was actually a voodoo priest, he lived in a community willing to believe that he was. Plenty of good Christians in Coosa County, Alabama, shook out their pillows at night and scrubbed their steps in the morning to fend off spirits and spells, warned their children that the hoodoo man would get them if they stayed out too late, and told their spouses that they would lay a trick on them if they did not stop drinking or lying about drinking. Coincidence just wasn't a word that rolled off tongues in Alabama as easily as conjuring, So when the Reverend Maxwell was acquitted of murdering his first wife and remarried the young widow of his conveniently deceased neighbor, a lot of people were convinced that he had used voodoo to fix the jury, put death on his neighbor's trail, and charm a much younger woman. Maybe the Reverend Maxwell had burned a court case candle or used lost stay-away oil. Perhaps he had nailed a photograph of his neighbor to the north-facing side of a tree and added another nail every morning for 9 mornings until the man weakened and died. As for the much younger, much prettier neighbor, well, he may have sprinkled wishing oil on a sample of her handwriting, worn it for 9 days by his heart, and then buried it under his front steps. You're probably at this moment wondering if you're in a nonfiction book talk and if Harper Lee was trying to write a nonfiction book. She was, and this one is too, and this chapter is a little tricky for me as a writer, and I think it was for her when she thought about this case, because, of course, there's not much evidence that the Reverend Maxwell, there's really no evidence that the Reverend Maxwell was actually a practitioner of voodoo. These are stories that were told about him, and these are the kinds of explanations that people proffered when the police couldn't hold him responsible, and indeed when he started to make a tremendous amount of money off of all of these deaths. He was collecting life insurance policies on these relatives. So that's why the police were so sure he had done it, and that's why his neighbors arrived at some of these theories. So bear with me. However unlikely such theories might seem, they were more comforting than the alternative. For many of the Reverend's neighbors, it was better to believe that in the face of conjuring, there was nothing that law enforcement and the judicial system could do, than to believe that in the face of such terrible crimes, they had not done enough. Supernatural explanations flourish where law and order fails, which is why as time passed and more people died, the stories about the Reverend grew stronger, stranger, and if possible, more sinister. The most widespread one began like a fairy tale with 7 sisters and 7 brothers. The Reverend Maxwell, people said, was the 7th son of a 7th son, a numerological curiosity that meant he had been born with power over life and death. To augment this natural gift, he supposedly went down to New Orleans to study voodoo with the 7 sisters, a fearsome septet then well known throughout the South. Although their history and even their existence are disputed, stories about the sisters have circulated since the 1920s. They were said to be clairvoyant, ageless, and available to sell their blessings, curses, candles, and potions to anyone who came calling at their 7 identical dwellings on Coliseum Street in the Garden District. Out-of-state license plates were always pulling up there, and people came and went at all hours of the day and night. Some of the visitors were just customers, but others were said to be disciples, including supposedly one lean, elegant, well-dressed man from Coosa County, Alabama. Never mind that the Reverend Willie Maxwell actually had just 4 brothers, plus 4 numerologically inconvenient sisters. The rumors about him continued to grow. Some said he hung white chickens upside down from the pecan trees outside his house to keep away unwanted spirits. Others that he painted blood on his doorsteps to keep away the authorities. Some said he carried envelopes filled with deadly powders, or that he had a whole room at home just for voodoo, labeled with jars that said love, hate, friendship, and death. If he got sick, he drank someone else's blood to feel better. Drive by his front door and the headlights of your car would go dark. Look him in the eye and he would curse you forever. He could move faster than was humanly possible, some people insisted, traveling the 150 miles from Birmingham to Atlanta in 20 minutes. If he needed to vanish quicker than that, he could turn into a black cat. And I probably don't have to tell you all much about black cats and voodoo, but it's certainly a strongly associated species with the subculture of voodoo. But you might well wonder, I didn't much introduce myself. I grew up in Maryland and I still live there. And so when I first came down to report on Harper Lee, I was this out-of-town reporter from Maryland. And you might well think that that paragraph, all the things that people said about the Reverend were just things fed to the out-of-town reporter. Things people thought I might want to hear that I'd reproduce. And when I started to look into Harper Lee's interest in this case, one of my favorite things I learned was that she adopted a stray cat when she lived in Alex City working on her book. And it was a black cat, and she called it Reverend Maxwell. Because people were already saying these kinds of things about him, and it was very much a part of the story. And so, the temptation would be to leave this paragraph out, right? You're working on a book like this, and you want to be responsible. You only want to include the truth, and indeed, part of Harper Lee's insistence when she came to this town to try and write her own in cold blood, she had helped Capote out in Kansas with his murder story. She kept telling people she just wanted the truth, and so what do you do with a paragraph like that? It's certainly true that even today you go and talk to people in Coosa County and they'll tell you all of those things. They told them to me in 2015, 2016. It's also true that voodoo, far from the kind of cultural pejorative it's become, is a very sincerely held and practiced system of beliefs for a lot of people in the South and in the Caribbean and, on the west coast of Africa and various countries. It is a legitimate form of religious practice and identity. So it's tricky to know what to do with it, and I felt like one of the interesting things in my book is, whether it's the history of life insurance or the history of voodoo, it was the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the things that had interested Harper Lee. And the truth is, she went and got a whole stack of voodoo books from an occult bookstore in New York, and she did a lot of research into how voodoo came to this country and how it was practiced. And some of the things she would have learned and some of the things I did might surprise you. Voodoo was always a syncretic practice, so it would not have surprised anyone in this part of Alabama that a Baptist minister was dabbling in voodoo. In fact, it was quite common. Many Catholic priests were practitioners too. It was incredibly interracial, so it was not just, a practice of the African American community. There were white practitioners, white clients, white suppliers. So there were all these things that made it make sense. So I think probably Harper Lee would have included some of that in her book. I certainly felt like I had to, because if you were going to understand what happened, you had to understand some of the fear and hysteria that accompanied this case. So I told you that part I read was from 1972, and between 1970 and 1977, the Reverend collected about $500,000 in life insurance. And he collected it on the first wife, the second wife, the nephew, the cousin, and the stepdaughter. And, over and over again, people started to wonder how he was getting away with it and how he would ever be held responsible. So by 1977, when his 16-year-old stepdaughter was found murdered and he was the prime suspect again, another relative of that girl's decided to do something about it. And at that girl's funeral, a man stood up and shot the Reverend 3 times in cold blood. So a vigilante murdered him in front of 300 people in the chapel of a funeral home in Alexander City. And that made national news, because that was the kind of story, if you have the book in front of you, or if you get the chance to pick it up, you can look at, or if you have your phone and you want to Google it, there are a lot of headlines, the United Press International, the Associated Press, all of these wire services ran stories about the Reverend Maxwell's murder, because it was one of these salacious stories nobody wanted to miss. Voodoo priest shot in cold blood, voodoo practitioner slain at girl's funeral. These utterly sensational headlines, including one in the New York Times, which Harper Lee read. So she found out about this case in the summer of 1977. She had not, as best we know, known anything about the Reverend in the earlier years when he was accused of these crimes one by one. She got interested when the vigilante got involved. And the thing to know about that vigilante is, I told you he shot and killed someone in front of 300 people. He needed a lawyer. He was charged right away with first-degree murder. And another way that this case is interesting, and I think why Harper Lee was particularly drawn to it, is the same lawyer who had defended the Reverend for 10 years. So he had defended him in all of these criminal investigations. He had defended him in a great deal of civil litigation, too, because you can imagine the police were frustrated by the Reverend Maxwell, but the insurance companies were furious. And they tried to stop payment, and they tried to get reduced settlements. And so a lot of these insurance policies had to be litigated, and only then did the Reverend get his money. So the same lawyer had represented him in, a dozen civil trials and all these criminal investigations, and that man's name was Tom Radney. And the day that the Reverend was murdered, Tom decided to take the case of the vigilante who murdered his former client. So the second third of the book is about this guy, Tom Radney, and he's an incredibly interesting character. Here we are in a state legislature. He, like Harper Lee's father, served in the state legislature, but he had very different politics than A.C. Lee. He was a supporter of the Kennedys during the Wallace years, and so that section of the book tells you a little bit about his political life and what made him a lawyer and how he got involved with the Reverend Maxwell. And some of those cases, Tom's reputation suffered as the Reverend's lawyer as much as the Reverend's reputation did. He was collecting about 40% of all of those insurance policies. So people took notice, and when he built a new law office in Alexander City, they called it the Maxwell House, because they knew where the money was coming from. So he's the second part of the book, and he's kind of the hinge, because he not only defends the vigilante, but he's really a go-to person for Harper Lee during her time in town. And Tom Radney, like a lot of people, thought he was going to be the hero of the book Harper Lee was writing, so he tried to be very, very helpful. But I like to read part of his section, and it really is the moment when Harper Lee met this story. It's when Tom Radney is trying to figure out what kind of a defense he's going to offer the vigilante. In the weeks after the Reverend Maxwell's funeral, the temperature in Alexander City barely fell below 100 degrees. June's hot spell turned to July's heat wave. The hayfields that generally had 2 cuttings by midsummer hadn't yet had 1. Cotton was a third of its usual height. The corn had dried up entirely, and most of the soybean crop hadn't even been sown. Dust devils swirled along the sides of the highways. The sun rose up every morning into an already smoldering day, scorched everything beneath it, and set into a stifling night. By the 3rd week of July in 1977, the drought was so severe that President Carter declared both Coosa County and Tallapoosa County, not to mention the rest of Alabama and Georgia, disaster areas. The heat that summer made the farmers crazy, and made the loggers crazy, and made the mill workers crazy, made basically everyone in town crazy except for the Iceman and the kids down at the lake. Which is how, one day, Tom Radney settled on his defense of Robert Burns, the vigilante. In the middle of July, when Burns was indicted by a grand jury, he did as Radney told him and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Insanity isn't an easy thing to prove, and it is often the defense of last resort. The belief that madness can be exculpatory is an ancient one, so ancient that it was carved into the Code of Hammurabi 1,700 years before the birth of Christ, alongside the notion of proportional retaliation, lex talionis, an eye for an eye. I told you I'm always giving you the deep history of things. That includes the insanity defense. So if you're not someone who likes history, this book finds its way through deep time, I would say. And that's true of Harper Lee, but also the kind of legal protocols that people followed in the 70s, and the history of architecture in Alabama, and all the things that I think lead up to this kind of incredible moment where Harper Lee is in the courtroom with these characters. And that's the thing to say. This was an incredibly remarkable trial for the people who lived in this area. It was the opportunity to bring before the court all the mystery and strangeness and misunderstanding of the previous 7 years. When you put someone, in the witness stand and they're under oath, it's a fascinating time for reporters, but also for observers, because they're forced to answer or to tell the truth to some extent. And so that moment would have been interesting to the people who knew of the Reverend Maxwell story, but it was incredibly interesting because that's the moment Harper Lee met this case. So at the trial of the vigilante, Harper Lee was in the courtroom. And the prologue of my book starts in that moment because the truth is not many people recognized her. To Kill a Mockingbird had come out in 1960, and the author photo that was used on that book had been taken by Truman Capote that same year. So it was an incredibly dated photo. She lived most of her adult life in New York City, so the people there might have known her as Nell, and even some of the ones who knew her just didn't always connect her to her book. And so she showed up in Alexander City. She actually had a niece who lived in town, and that niece had married a guy who owned a motel, so she had connections and she had a place to stay. But over and over again, she had to introduce herself as Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. And over again, people were surprised by that introduction, because she was not the kind of author sometimes we think of today who goes on Oprah and who's on CNN all the time. She really lived in a kind of chosen anonymity. And so I'll read just a tiny bit from her section of the book. And I told you she enters that case in the fall of '77, but this chapter is called Disappearing Act. I should warn you, this chapter has 2 curse words, and I'm loath to curse in a chamber of the state legislature, but both curse words come from a woman who I interviewed, and she's a fascinating character, and you'll meet her in a minute, but she was 91 years old when she uttered them, and she has since died, so if you're mad about it, she's too dead to care about your hurt feelings. But I do want to warn you, there's one curse word at the beginning and one midway through. It was the damnedest thing, but Marion Pittman Allen couldn't find a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird anywhere in Washington. Mrs. James Browning Allen was the second wife of the junior senator from the great state of Alabama, and in that role she was expected not only to attend the ladies of the Senate luncheon, but to present the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter, with a book representative of her home state. It was obvious to Allen which book she should bring, since there was no Alabama tale more famous than the one about the adventures of a tomboy named Scout and her heroic lawyer of a father, Atticus Finch. But even though there were millions of copies of Nell Harper Lee's novel in circulation at the time, Allen couldn't find a single one for sale in the nation's capital. Allen was Lee's age, and they had both dropped out of the University of Alabama around the same time. Lee had been a student at the law school and quit to write. Allen had been a journalism student and quit to have children. Her first marriage didn't take, and she had 3 mouths to feed, so she began working as a reporter for a handful of newspapers around Birmingham. That's how she met her second husband, who was then Lieutenant Governor James Browning Allen, a widower with 2 children of his own. She heard church bells on her way to interview him for a story and prayed that it wasn't a sign, but 4 months later they were married, and 4 years after that they were moving to Washington for him to take his seat in the United States Senate. Allen didn't like to make a big production out of her role as a lady of the Senate, but she also didn't want to embarrass her husband or her state, so she was determined to bring the right gift to Mrs. Carter. When she couldn't find the book, she went looking for its author. Allen knew that she and Lee had a mutual friend from their Tuscaloosa days, and she thought that he might know how to get a hold of her. Nearly everyone in the state would have recognized John Forney's voice, and the half who were Alabama fans basically thought it was the voice of God. Couldn't tell if I was near enough to Alabama to get a laugh on that. You guys probably don't know who John Forney is. There's no reason to, but he'd been calling the play-by-play for the Crimson Tide for over a decade. So it's just a very recognizable voice of the state. John, Allen said when the sportscaster answered, "Do you know where Nell Lee is? I've simply got to find a copy of her book." After she explained why, Forney told her that Lee was in Alexander City. Allen knew Alex City well. Her first husband had been born and raised there. In the years when her own father was building levees on the Mississippi River and living with her mother in a tent on its banks, her ex-father-in-law had been hobnobbing in the Alabama State Senate. After that, he'd gone to Alex City to serve for more than 3 decades as the town's attorney. As best as Marion Pittman Allen could remember, the most exciting thing that had ever happened in that part of Alabama was her ex-father-in-law climbing into the bed of a pickup truck to deliver one of his speeches, unfailingly fiery numbers that could draw an audience from 3 counties. But the oratorical wizard of Channahatchee Creek had long since died, and she couldn't imagine what would entice a world-famous author to that part of the state. What in the world, Allen asked Forney incredulously, is Lee doing in Alex City? Lee was there writing, Forney said, but if Allen could give him a little time, he would try and get in touch with the author. A few hours later, Forney called back and said that he had tracked Lee down at the Horseshoe Bend Motel. Maybe she knew it. It was that hexagon-shaped number out on Highway 280. He had been given the go-ahead to give her the writer's private telephone number. It was like she was hiding behind damn trees down there, Allen remembers. But I got the secret number and we talked for over an hour. They talked about small-town lawyers, since Allen wondered if Lee knew anything about her ex-father-in-law, and they talked about journalism, since Lee was a regular reader of Allen's syndicated newspaper column, Reflections of a News Hen. When Allen finally got around to asking Harper Lee why she was hanging her hat in Alex City, the author wouldn't say much. Just that she had been there for a few months, working on something that had to do with a voodoo preacher. Lee did say, though, that she would make sure a copy of her novel got to the nation's capital by May 15, 1978, in time for the luncheon. True to her word, Lee sent a signed first edition of her book inscribed on the front page to Rosalind Carter, along with a verse from one of the hymns to wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Mrs. Allen presented the book to Mrs. Carter at the Ladies of the Senate luncheon, which, as it happens, was the last one of those she'd ever attend. 2 weeks later, after she and her husband returned to Alabama for the summer recess, Senator James Browning Allen died of a heart attack. Not long after that, George Wallace appointed Marion Pittman Allen to her husband's seat, making her the state's 2nd female senator. Overwhelmed both personally and professionally, she forgot all about the Pulitzer Prize winner holed up at the Horseshoe Bend Motel. It was easy enough to forget about Harper Lee in those days. To Kill a Mockingbird had come out 18 years before, and in all that time, Lee had published almost nothing else. 3 short essays for 2 glossy magazines, 2 tiny profiles that were favors for her friend Truman Capote, 1 satirical recipe for cracklin' bread, and a novelty cookbook. In nearly 2 decades, that was the only writing she had put into the world. No second novel had followed the first, and she hadn't given an interview in 14 years. The last time she had so much as agreed to be quoted in print, it was another favor for Capote. In 1976, he had asked Lee to sit with him during an interview for People magazine, which was running a profile of him. She had said a total of 12 words on the record, 7 of which are, "We are bound by a common anguish." To Kill a Mockingbird had made Lee extravagantly wealthy, but you wouldn't have known it to look around her life. When she was in New York, she lived in a small, rent-controlled apartment on the Upper East Side. It's one of my favorite facts in the book. Briefly, Harper Lee had 2 kind of unremarkable neighbors at the time, John and Daryl, and they would go on to become Hall and Oates. So it's really great. One of the things I loved about getting to do research into this period of Harper Lee's life is she was in the city, going to the Frick, going to the Met, having cocktails at Elaine's. She's actually just this incredibly cosmopolitan person, and so that building becomes a kind of character in the book because you really get to know some of the people who came and went and some of the characters who she befriended there. And, far from the reclusive portrait of Harper Lee I think we were all fed, she was alive and well and thriving. So I think it's very interesting to think about her in that space. And indeed, just to remember, so I'm about to tell you, when she was back in Alabama, she stayed with one of her sisters. So you all probably have heard of Alice Lee, but she stayed in her sister's house and just had a small room there. So she really did live a lot of her adult life in New York City. But no matter where she was, she avoided the press, her fans, and anything that seemed too literary. She tried to live her life as if she had never published one of the most popular novels in American history. In 1962, the year the film adaptation of her book came out, the one that earned Gregory Peck an Oscar and further fixed her portrait of a small southern town in the nation's collective memory, Lee told a reporter for the Mobile Register that she wanted to disappear. And she basically had. But now, alone in a motel in the middle of nowhere, with the world no longer watching, she was nearly as free as she had been in the tiny flat where she had written To Kill a Mockingbird. That was what she chose not to tell Senator Marion Pittman Allen that day on the telephone. Harper Lee was in Alexander City because finally, all these years later, she was going to write another book. Do y'all watch Law & Order? Yeah, that's the kind of dun-dun-dun moment. So that's the first chapter of this section about Harper Lee, and I tell you a lot about her life and what brought her to this case and ultimately what made it hard for her to write about it. Because I think that on the one hand, Harper Lee's life as a writer after 1960 was constantly characterized by failure. So she started a lot of novels in the 1960s she could never bring to fruition, and none of which she felt were of high enough quality to be published. And then she took a little bit of a break, and then in 1977, when she found this true crime story, she very conspicuously and deliberately told a lot of people, friends, family, strangers, when she was interviewing them, and she spent 9 months in this town looking into the story of the Reverend. She told them all that she was working on a nonfiction book. And what happened to that book and what happened to the ambition and the energy she brought to that story is, I think, a particular version of failure. So it's different than the books that came before, although, I recognize that's an emotional category as much as it is a kind of literary category. So that's the last third of the book. It really is everything I can tell you about her life and work on this book, but in general, it's an attempt to tell you what happened to her as a writer. Because I think for those of us, I grew up, I loved To Kill a Mockingbird as a kid, and I have a slightly different relation to it as an adult, but I think it is a beautiful and interesting book, and a book whose importance to our culture, rather than being imperiled by Ghost Had a Watchman, was made deeper and more meaningful. I think this is a very interesting story to tell about those two books and how an editor helps a writer and how ambitious a writer is with the kind of political story they try to bring to fruition. But, Harper Lee, for most of her life after To Kill a Mockingbird, struggled to figure out how to be a writer and how to be a person in the world. And so I think that's really the kind of deep core of the last third of the book. We look at this particular true crime book that she tried to write, but in general, it's an attempt to account for all the years that followed after To Kill a Mockingbird. Because that book is strange, it's set in the Great Depression, so for a lot of people who read it, she already felt anachronistic. They didn't know it had come out in 1960, or by the time they read it in 1980 or 1990 or 2000 or 2010, no one really wondered about Harper Lee. And occasionally when they did, there was just simply no information because she refused to cooperate with the press. But I think one of the things that was rewarding for me as a reporter with this book was to realize not wanting to talk to the press doesn't mean you didn't want to talk to anyone. And there was this vibrancy to Harper Lee's life that took place, that wasn't on, television screens with Oprah or in the front page of the New York Times. She was busy and hard at work and really doing interesting things. So that's the last part of the book. And I'm happy to take questions about her or about the original crime story, because that's obviously a huge part of the book too, or about anything at all, really. I think I've managed to not talk for too long. The truth is I can talk for a very long time about Harper Lee, but I've tried to leave time for questions, and I have tried to give shorter answers to questions. So by all means, I hope that you all have them. Yes, sir.
Capote's writing as both a novelist and an author of family nonfiction, murder,
Yeah, this is a great question. So the question is about Truman Capote. And if you thought I could talk for a long time about Harper Lee, I can talk for a long time about Truman Capote too. What a wildly strange coincidence that these two writers, probably you all know this, and if you saw either the biopics that came out about the writing of In Cold Blood, you know that Capote and Lee were childhood friends. So Capote was actually born in Louisiana. You all have every right to claim him, but he lived some of his childhood in Monroeville, right next door to Harper Lee. And he had some cousins who lived there, and his complicated home life meant that he actually spent 3 consecutive years there and then returned for many of his adolescent summers. And so he and Lee were quite close, and they wrote little stories together and little poems together as children, and they stayed in touch when his mother remarried and moved to New York. And in fact, when she got up the courage to quit college, to quit law school and move to New York, that was her first point of contact. So they reconnect at that moment, and then Harper Lee goes out to Kansas with Capote when he's working on the story that became In Cold Blood. And he uses a tremendously condescending title for her. He called her his assistant researchist. But he does at least dedicate In Cold Blood to her, and that was deserved because she had made several trips with him to Kansas, interviewed a lot of the people who were involved in that true crime story, and yes, of course, then formed her own opinions about the genre. So the question is, to what extent does Capote shape her work on this book she was trying to write in Alexander City? And I think a great deal. The truth is there's some correspondence that has come out. Harper Lee stayed in touch with some of the people in Kansas who were characters in the book, and she stayed very close with Truman Capote's fact checker at the New Yorker, who had helped bring the In Cold Blood originally ran as a 4-part series in the New Yorker, and Harper Lee stayed close with that fact checker, and the truth is, in all of that correspondence, she expresses a great deal of disapproval for In Cold Blood. And disapproval for the liberties that Capote took with some of the facts of the story and the ways that, in very deliberate ways, Capote took an absence of fact and tried to provide it, and was not afraid to use psychological speculation or to fill out scenes that he thought might be more dramatic or more moving than the reality of what he knew. So the best example of that, if you've not followed the kind of discourse, as it were, around In Cold Blood, you might well remember that In Cold Blood ends in a scene at the cemetery. So this is the story of this awful story of a home invasion and the murder of 4 family members. And the end of In Cold Blood is the lead detective who solves the murder case with a friend of one of the deceased, and they're together looking at the graves. Never happened. I'm sure that those 2 people did go often to the Clutter family graves, but that particular scene never happened. Capote never witnessed it. He decided to close the book with this emotionally important scene, but it was a fabrication. And those are the kinds of things that Lee, having been along for the reporting, was able to spy the kind of exaggerations and the liberties that he had taken. And she was very disapproving. She had an incredibly conservative definition of journalism. And, look, the truth is she wrote an autobiographical novel, but a novel, and never presumed that it represented the facts of the matter, and in fact honored this incredibly wide distinction between fiction and nonfiction. It was not a porous boundary for her. So what Capote had ultimately marketed as a, quote, nonfiction novel was for her a contradiction in terms. And I think some of what she was doing in Alexander City was quite conspicuously telling the world, I am going to do old-fashioned journalism of the straightforward, factual kind. I only want the facts. I don't want speculation. I don't want rumor. I want to know what happened, and I want to report it as accurately as I can. And I don't want to fill out. Now, those are wonderful ambitions. I think it's part of what made it incredibly hard for her to finish the book. She couldn't have chosen a worse case to try and implement that strategy. Look, I just read you. It's part of the reason I like to read that section about voodoo. Is it true or is it false? It is certainly true that people say those things about the Reverend Maxwell, but it is not true, that, as best I can tell, or that anyone has ever found evidence of, that he was a practitioner of voodoo. And in some of her correspondence about this case, Harper Lee complains that, she thought she'd found a murder story, but it turned out to be too much it was a case about life insurance. So there again, Capote chose this incredible nightmare for white Americans, a statistically not representative crime. This was a home invasion. 4 members of the same family were murdered by a stranger. That is not representative of the kind of crime that happens over and over again in this country. It is the stuff of nightmares. There's a reason that book became so fixed in our culture and why it moves so many of us to be afraid of strangers and to think about our communities in different ways. But Harper Lee chose a very different case. And even in the way that it was a story about life insurance, The truth is, life insurance at this time was incredibly discriminatory and predatory towards African American clients. So on the one hand, you have the Reverend Maxwell, who is, let's be honest, a great connoisseur of insurance fraud. But the industry was incredibly fraudulent towards African Americans. They were overpricing the policies. They were refusing to pay them out. There has, in the last 10 years, been a multi-billion-dollar settlement to try and make restitution for this. So here's Harper Lee with this case that's supposed to be about one thing, but it's about another. She's basically chosen a Boo Radley character, a character about whom much is said but not much is known. Beyond that, she has exactly the kind of Atticus Finch character one most associates with Watchmen. So Tom Radney, that lawyer who's at the center of the book, thought of himself in a certain way, and in a letter she tells someone that he thought of himself as a cross between Atticus Finch and Robert Redford. And she, of course, had a different judgment. And she chose this morally complicated character. And so I think a lot of that was directly in response to In Cold Blood. I think she wanted to pick a harder case. I think she wanted to pick the kind of case that publishers, when she was trying to sell Ghost at a Watchman, didn't want. A complicated story about systemic racism, not about, overt villainry or the kind of consolidated bad characters of Bob Ewell. She wanted to look at systemic fraud and predation. Now, having said that, Capote finished his book and she never finished hers, as best I can tell. So she had a lot of opinions in relationship to In Cold Blood, but I think at the end of the day, you have to judge a writer by what they produced, and Capote produced In Cold Blood, and it's a complicated and flawed book, but we don't have this book, The Reverend, that Harper Lee claims she was writing. So a wonderful question. I love Capote. He keeps turning up in the book, and their lives intersected in strange and interesting ways, but I think the most critical way was in their work on In Cold Blood together. Yes, ma'am. I promise I'll be shorter. I really try to stop talking. Go ahead.
Can you share how you feel about revealing things that Harper Lee would never want us to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how do I feel about revealing things Harper Lee might not have ever wanted to have be made public? And I assume that's an informed question. So I think that in the book, Harper Lee had several very open secrets in her life, and one of them was a struggle with drinking, and another was a struggle with depression. And so I don't think, those are not things that were revealed to anyone who knew her. The book is formed by the opinions and the stories and the kind of consolidated memory of many of her close friends and family. So obviously I wasn't telling any of those people those facts. They were telling me. And they were providing stories, especially once she had passed. So Harper Lee died in 2016. I started working on the book in 2015, but a year into that work, she passed away. And there had already been people who were wanting to share their stories of her before they died and couldn't. And then once she died, there was, I felt, an even greater sense of urgency on the part of people who knew her to offer a more complicated and realistic portrait of her. Because I think without that information, without the very human struggles of this incredibly, important writer, I'm not sure what the explanation for her failure to publish would have been. So the question is, To Kill a Mockingbird came out in 1960, and she passed in 2016. And, if you don't have the truth of what her life was like, which is to say that, she had a kind of writerly perfectionism that made it hard for her to get started and hard for her to accept that work was good. And she had a natural predisposition to depression that was exacerbated by the failure to write, and an appetite for self-medication that meant she could drink too much and not handle the liquor she was consuming. If you don't have that drama, it seems to me that there's an unsatisfying explanation for why she never wrote again. And maybe even something as callous as she was lazy or, lacked talent. And, there's a reason I think for years there was this pernicious rumor that Capote had written To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think that only makes sense in the context of a failure to explain her experience as a writer. And I think what's sad for people, it's both sad for the people who witnessed these dysfunctional behaviors in her life, and it's sad for those of us who wish she could have just produced more and more novels because we love the ones she did write. I think that the tragedy of those facts is that they're all remediable. Look, Capote is a writer who struggled with addiction but managed to write a lot. And there are a lot of writers who struggle with depression, but they get therapy or they find medication and they find a way to regulate their own behavior and to get help. And I think for Harper Lee, the problem was that pathological privacy prevented her from getting the help she needed. And I think that was one of the other things that animated some of the people who shared their stories about her, this sense that there did not need to be another writer with as much talent as Harper Lee who didn't feel comfortable getting help. And it was heartbreaking, some of the people who would tell me these stories, when I would say, well, did you ever recommend AA? AA was coming into vogue in this very period, and plenty of other writers were using it to find, help and community in these struggles. And of course they said, oh gosh, no, she would never have talked about her problems. And then I quote some interviews in the book where she's incredibly judgmental about psychotherapy and the way that, at that time there was this craze to get talk therapy, and psychoanalysis was becoming more common, and she was incredibly disapproving of it and said, that self-pity is the greatest sin. And so I think, look, the struggle was her own, and so I know what you mean. It's certainly true that she would never have wanted the world to know those things. But I think the problem and the deep flaw of her logic was, had the world known, they would only have wanted to help, right? None of us want to pass judgment on her. And I think had those things been known at the time, then people who knew and loved her might have felt even more empowered to help. But as it was, I think that a lot of her friends and family are happy for the anonymity she had in New York, because you didn't want people who saw the writer on the bar stool falling off to be the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. It was fine if she was just Nell from Manhattan. But she had this huge public reputation to live into. And the truth is, you asked that question about Harper Lee, but I think it's important for writers of nonfiction, people who write about other people's lives, to have that standard for anyone they write about. So Harper Lee is a famous novelist, but this book is filled with people who did not ever have the notoriety she did, and I cared just as much about the facts of their life and reporting them responsibly. I think that some people wish this book were all about Harper Lee, like it were just a full-length biography, and I think she's an interesting person, but so is Tom Radney, so is the Reverend Maxwell, so are, Marion Pittman Allen, that 91-year-old senator I told you about. This book is populated with people, not all of whom history remembers. And I would like to think that they are all handled as delicately, as carefully as I did Harper Lee. But I'll tell you, one final thing. I think you asked the right question. What would she have thought about this? But I'll tell you, her great disapproval of Capote was for inaccuracy and a lack of truth. And I don't think there's anything in this book about her that isn't true or accurate. And so I think as much as it would have pained her to have it be made public, she would have admired the scrupulousness with which it is reported. It's easy to put rumor and innuendo in a book, and it's harder to get people to put their names on it and to source it responsibly. And you'll see I was lucky with my publisher. There's a very long note section about all the people who shared their stories and where the letters and the materials that I quoted from come from. So I would like to think begrudgingly she might have admired that, even if she didn't like being the subject of another book. Yes, ma'am. It's a fun question for a writer. It's a craft question. How did I decide to organize it? So the book does have these three parts, and if you look at the contents, again, I think the more straightforward thing to do would have just been to write a book about Harper Lee that had a really long section about the Maxwell case, and I just wanted the book to be more democratic than that. I thought that, she found this great story, and I wanted as best I could to do justice to the story itself, so that meant the Reverend had to be a character. And I think that once we all read Go Set a Watchman and realized the complexity she brought to the lawyerly characters of her novels, I thought then I needed to honor what probably would have been the main character of her book, which was Tom Radney. So that's why I thought they each deserve their own section. And, if you're only in it for true crime, I realize I've spoken mostly to the Harper Lee fans. If you're a true crime fan, I think that structure is satisfying in another way, because all of the documentaries you watch on Netflix or the true crime books that you read or the kind of podcasts you listen to, I think it's important to realize, in the same way that Capote did with In Cold Blood, these people are making strategic decisions about the information they have, the sources who will cooperate, the kinds of ways they are ascribing character and making sense of the world. The world doesn't happen in plots. The world happens, and it's messy, and it's hard to sort out the truth of things. But, people who make podcasts and documentaries and write books have to make decisions about these things. So if you're just in it for true crime, I think Harper Lee becomes an interesting character because you get to evaluate all the decisions she's making. So you are armed with all of the information I could find about the original crime story, And you can use that to make judgments about the decisions that Capote made in Cold Blood and that she was making in her book, The Reverend. And, it just pulls back the curtain on a genre that, look, she's not the only one to have complaints about. I think a lot of people who lose loved ones find the true crime industry to be predatory and exploitative and insensitive, and I tried to honor some of those considerations in the book. It was certainly on my mind as I thought about digging back into stories that were, for some of the families involved, the most horrific experiences they ever had. This story was a lurid curiosity for a lot of the white families in Coosa County and Tallapoosa County, but it was a horror story for a lot of the African Americans there. So those kinds of decisions are rendered conspicuously when it comes to Harper Lee. I don't bore you with my experience reporting the book, but I tell you a lot about hers. And you can think about what it would be like to be an out-of-town reporter. She was just as much out of town as I was. She came from Monroeville, which was, across the state. You can parachute in from anywhere, not just Maryland, but from Monroeville or Manhattan. So, I think you can sit with all of her experiences, and that's why, again, the structure has what I hope is a payoff. I promise it's not repetitive. You're not just getting the same story 3 times. You're getting the murders as they happened from 1970 to 1977, and then you're getting the trial of the vigilante, which is this consolidated experience in 1977, and then you're getting Harper Lee and the kind of afterlife of this case, because of course the moment she got interested in it, she became a part of the story. And the way people talk about the Maxwell case now involves her, and involves her interest, and involves the book she was trying to write about it. And it's mystery on top of mystery because her own involvement made it even more notable and even stranger for the people who lived through it. So that's the structure, but I always like to say, if you think you can do it better, go. This is such a fascinating case, and she's such an interesting writer that you could have written this book some other ways too. And I think it's fun, structure is something she struggled with. And if you look at Go Set a Watchman and you look at To Kill a Mockingbird, there are very interesting editorial decisions and revisions that take the same story and structure it very differently and occupy a very different perspective towards the characters. It's not just that the chronologic setting changes, the whole structure of the book changes. I think Tay Hohoff, the woman who helped Lee write To Kill a Mockingbird, is up there with Maxwell Perkins. Tremendously important editor who worked with Lee, but several other writers too, and, saw a way to build a better book from the same story. So structure and editing and revision, I think these are all important things, and over again, they're the things she struggled with. So it's another way I hope that the structure pays off.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Collins, LLC.